Welcome back to Thimbleberry U. I'm John Jack Gay. As always, I'm here with Amy Wallace from Thimbleberry Financial. Hello, Amy.
Hi, Jack.
So don't be scared by the title of this podcast. So we're going to talk today about...
Doom.
I don't even know what kind of sound effect I'd use here, but we're talking about what to do when someone dies. And it's a topic that people like to avoid, but it is so critically important. We're going to talk today about what needs to happen when someone passes away. It's difficult, the legal and financial steps. It's going to be really confusing. Let's start again at the ground floor here, Amy. Why is this something people need to be prepared for?
Jack, I think we are both going to try to make this a somewhat lighthearted topic, even though there's nothing lighthearted about it. But, you asked the question, why is this something people need to be prepared for? Well, hopefully listeners are hearing this before someone passes. It might be while they're in the process and they're thinking ahead to what needs to happen. If you are a listener listening to this after someone has passed and you're trying to figure out what to do, please understand that we aren't making light of someone passing. It is simply, it's not fun to make a sad podcast.
Right.
And why I hope people are listening to this before they need it is that once we're in that grief period, the last thing you want to do is try to figure out details.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, even if you're a detail-oriented person, most people's grieving is not, let me get into fine details about how things happen. So it creates extra hurdles. So the more we understand beforehand, the easier it will be when the time comes.
I'm friendly with an estate planning attorney, and she has told me that when you put somebody in charge of your wishes for after you pass away, you're really not doing them any favors. It can be a really onerous task. And to your point, if you're trying to do it while compounded by grief, it's almost impossible. So these are going to be really important, actionable steps we talk about today. So what happens when someone passes away? Right away, what are the first things someone needs to do when a loved one passes?
So this may be more than what our listeners are looking for from a financial planning podcast around this, but the first priority is to notify the right people and take care of immediate concerns. So there's the things to do now, and there's the things to do soon, and the things to do later. Not all the things are at this moment. So the immediate concerns are getting a legal pronouncement of death. Mm-hmm. If the person was in a hospital or hospice, the staff handles this. But if they passed away at home, it's important to call 911 or hospice if they were under care.
Right.
It's also important to notify immediate family and close friends. Now, that's a really emotional step, and it's okay to lean on others to help spread the word, the proverbial phone chain.
I will actually give a personal story on that piece of it. So as I think I've told you offline before, and for our listeners' benefit, when I was 25, my college roommate, my best friend, he was unfortunately killed by a drunk driver. And his sister called me that morning. She was going from where she lived in Washington, D.C. to where they lived in Syracuse. She told me, and she said, I don't have any of your Syracuse friends' phone numbers. Could you start making phone calls for me? So that was my role. My role was to, despite the shock and grief of it all, was to be that phone chain so that she wasn't trying to find people's phone numbers while she was driving and grieving and dealing with the shock of this. That was my role. So that's the easiest thing you can ask somebody to do. They don't have to be an expert in anything. And if you're just asking them to make a phone call, that can take a load off your plate.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about doing this before someone passes, it may be even identifying 5 or 6 friends, all from different groups that maybe don't overlap much, and letting each of them know so that they can spread the word.
For sure.
Next, it's arranging the body to be transported. If pre-planned funeral arrangements exist, well, then it's following those.
Yep.
And if those pre-planned funeral arrangements don't exist, a funeral home will need to be chosen.
Right.
Next, and this one I think can get missed sometimes, is securing the person's home and belongings.
Oh, yeah.
Making sure the doors are locked, valuables are safe, pets are cared for. It might also be, in this case, this could fall into soon. It might be now, depending. Might be look in the fridge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or run the dishwasher with what's in it.
Yeah, sure. The spoilage is sooner rather than later, I think. And then,
absolutely.
And obviously the pets, I'm a big dog person. The pets is something that makes sure that piece is taken care of immediately.
Absolutely.
All right, so those are the immediate steps, Amy. What about the next phase, that shorter period of time following?
The next phase is handling the legal and financial matters. So some of these may be sooner, some of them may be longer, later, and they're going to have steps in between. So one is to get multiple copies of the death certificate. This is a thing that I often hear people not understanding is how many copies of the death certificate are going to be needed.
Oh, right.
Because each financial institution, whether that's insurance or banks or investment custodians, for legal purposes, death certificates are needed for all of them. And so know that funeral homes or county offices can provide those. But ask for more than you think you'll need. Locate the will and estate documents.
Yes.
If there's a will, the executor will need to file it with the probate court. And if there's no will, the court will appoint someone to handle the estate.
You're begging me to make in if there's a will, there's a way joke, but...
You also want to notify key institutions, Social Security, the banks, the investment custodians, the mortgage lenders, any pension providers. This should be on the sooner list, especially for things like Social Security and pensions, because if they continue to pay out, they're going to ask for the money back.
Yeah.
So you want to get that filed right away. You also want to notify credit card companies, the utility companies, handle any subscriptions because they'll need to be closed or transferred. In notifying key institutions, if you can, figure out where the passwords are and get in and clean out. Just start shutting things down. That obviously can be a little bit later.
Right. And we've talked about that in a
immediate.
previous podcast is you want to give somebody digital access to your things as part of your estate planning is you want to know who to give more than just, hey, best friend, delete my Facebook. But I think but on the serious side, it's, hey, here's how to access all of my online accounts, whether they're financial or otherwise.
Yes. And the best way to do that is to be using an online password vault that has measures where if you haven't logged in a certain number of days, it's going to allow someone you designated to get access to your vault.
Absolutely.
The last thing I'm going to say here around what needs to happen is determine if probate's needed. And I do suggest talking with an attorney about this. Probate is the legal process of settling an estate. And whether it's needed or not depends on how assets were owned and how much is owned in different ways.
Okay, now I know this is a question for a whole other podcast, but let's briefly touch on this. When is probate actually required?
Jag, it is a good question. The answer depends on how assets were owned and essentially the amount of assets. And that's going to vary state to state.
Yeah.
Let me give you 3 real-life examples to help explain it. So this example is when probate is required. So let's say we'll call her Susan. Her father, Robert, passed away. He had a house, some bank accounts, a car in his name only. He had a will that left everything to Susan. But because those assets were in his name alone, the will has to go through probate for Susan to take legal ownership.
Okay.
Okay, so if things are passing through a will, probate is needed. Okay, it's the court that administers wills. So this means that Susan will need to file with the probate court, wait for approval, and go through the legal steps before she can sell the house, access bank accounts, etc.
And it should be mentioned, too, when you have to go through probate, it's a legal process. There's an expense associated with that. And probate court are public court filings. So all the information that's going through the probate court becomes public record. That's an important point.
Yes.
Okay, when would probate not be required? Let's talk about an example of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about Mike and Laura. So again, hypothetical, but they're married or were married and Mike passes away. All of their major assets, like the house, the bank accounts, investment accounts, were jointly owned. Now, I didn't mention retirement accounts, and some listener might be saying, well, major assets, retirement accounts are major and they can't be jointly owned. This is true. They cannot be. They're individually owned. So the things that are major that can be jointly owned are things like the house, the bank accounts, and the investment accounts.
Got it.
So since Laura was already a co-owner on these assets, she automatically gets to retain the ownership without going through probate. All she needs to do is provide a death certificate to the banks and the title agencies to get the ownership changed from joint to her name.
Okay, so we've talked about probate being required, probate not being required. And in some cases, I know having a trust can avoid probate as well.
You're correct. So let's talk about another scenario. We'll call her Jane. She has a revocable living trust. She puts her house, her investment accounts, and other key assets into the trust while she is alive. Okay, she can change that while she's alive, thus the revocable living trust.
Mm-hmm.
When she passes away, that trust becomes irrevocable, and her daughter Emily was named in the original documents as successor trustee. Jane didn't have any assets not owned by the trust. So since everything was already in the trust, Emily does not need to send Jane's estate through probate.
Okay.
She can simply follow Jane's instructions outlined in the trust and distribute the assets directly. So what this does is it saves time, legal fees, and some stress.
As we talked about earlier. So, Amy, probate happens when assets are in someone's name alone, but it can be avoided if these things are set up correctly ahead of time.
That's exactly right. And that's why estate planning is so valuable and why we talk about making sure it's done ahead of time. Obviously, I'm a financial advisor. I am not a lawyer.
Right.
I am not an estate planning attorney. But the work of estate planning ties so closely, it's essentially married to financial planning for financial planning to be complete. And that's why we're talking about it, because a financial plan is not complete without estate planning being done. It saves family members a lot of headaches after someone passes.
Okay, so we've talked about probate. So when probate is over, or if it wasn't required, what's next after that?
At that point, the focus is going to shift to wrapping things up and ensuring everything is legally closed out.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking a little bit like dotting I's and crossing T's. Yeah. So it's distributing personal belongings and assets. These might be defined in some of those legal documents. It's closing remaining accounts and debts. It's going through that password vault, essentially, making sure everything's closed up. Handling the final taxes. This is something that a lot of people don't think about. There's a final tax return to be filed.
All right.
And depending, it could actually be 2 tax returns. There's definitely the income tax, or more than likely, there's the income tax return, but there may also be an estate tax return that needs to be filed. And then it's supporting family members emotionally and financially as needed. This is a hard time for people. And depending on what the family dynamics or family friend dynamics are, someone may be caught a little high and dry with money not being available if it's tied up in probate and was expected to maybe pay a mortgage if a family member is living in the house.
That's a really good point. We're not talking just waiting for an inheritance here. We're talking about some smaller stuff that could be critically important. So I'm glad you said that. Obviously, you want to support the family members emotionally, but I hadn't thought about that financial piece of it. I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah, there's just sometimes fallout, right? I mean, the best laid plans, there unfortunately can be some unintended consequences. And that might have not been the situation when the estate plan was created. That's why we want to make sure it still fits along the way, but things pop up.
Right, and we said at the top, Amy, that obviously you want to do more prep before as opposed to after. So ideally, how can families prepare ahead of time to make this whole process easier?
It's what we just talked about. Plan ahead. And the things that will help are make sure you have a will at a minimum and that it's updated. Just having the will, if you made it 20, 30 years ago, doesn't mean it's appropriate for today. So have a time, at least, every couple years where you take a little bit and review it.
You've seen the soap operas. You're out of the will. You're back in the will. You're out of the will. You're back in the will.
Jag, I don't know what you do during the day.
When I was a kid and my mom was watching them, I'll just put that disclaimer.
Consider a trust. If avoiding probate is important to you, you might want that revocable living trust in order to protect your assets at your passing. Mm-hmm. Have a list of all your financial accounts and key documents. Compile that to make someone else's life easier. Now, again, we've talked about the password vault. This is a great place to put, if you've given access to somebody, to have all those institutions named, to keep copies of those estate planning documents or notes about where the originals are. It really can simplify people's lives. Mm-hmm. Discuss your final wishes with family. Even though it's a tough conversation and they may have their own ideas, and yes, you're not here to experience what they decide ultimately, But if it's important to you, if you have preferences, it's important to share those.
You don't want to make an assumption about somebody's final wishes ever.
No. And then consistently review beneficiary designations on everything that has a beneficiary designation. Other assets can have a beneficiary designation also. We didn't really have that in the 3 examples of probate that we talked about, but a house can have a beneficiary designation. Yep. A car can have that. Bank accounts, CDs can have that. Brokerage accounts can have that. Anything that has a beneficiary designation or a TOD, transfer on death, or a POD, payable on death designation, those are beneficiary designations, should be checked regularly.
Got it. Well, Amy, this is obviously so important. I'm glad we had this conversation today. Little planning now can save a lot of stress later. As we wrap up, what should listeners' key takeaways be from this conversation?
Main points, I think, in the first 24 to 48 hours, focus on legal pronouncements, notifying family, securing the home.
Yeah.
Then in the first few weeks, handle the will, notifying financial institutions, determining if probate's necessary. Probate is required when assets are in someone's name alone, but it can be avoided with joint ownership or a trust. Mm-hmm. And also those beneficiary designations that we talked about. After probate, final steps include distributing assets, filing the taxes, and closing accounts.
Yeah.
This is an area where I see things fairly regularly get hung up. And sometimes it's just the emotional phase, or there's a few dominoes that need to fall into place before this can happen. And it's waited a while and it's become heavy and draining, different than right after the passing.
Yeah.
And then lastly, but maybe most importantly, plan ahead with a will, a trust, and clear conversations.
Yes. This is such a taboo topic, but the communication is just so important.
It is.
All right, Amy, if one of our listeners wants to come talk to you about this or anything related to financial planning, how do they find you and your team at Thimbleberry Financial?
Well, if they want to talk to us initially, they should give us a call at 503-610-6510. They can also find us online at thimbleberryfinancial.com with information, and a simple click on the Let's Chat button will connect us.
Awesome. Good stuff, Amy. We'll talk again in a couple weeks.
Sounds great, Jag. Look forward to it.
Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Thimbleberry Financial are not affiliated. Discussions in this show should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult with your investment professional before making important investment decisions. Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Thimbleberry Financial are not affiliated.